story is actually about 3 women who changed the course of my life. So we're going to start the journey in a little village called La Villa Santa Maria. This is where my mom was born, and she lived there with my grandmother many, many years ago. And she had 3 sisters. And after World War II, right as the war was ending, my grandfather, who I never met, was killed in a work camp. He was killed trying to escape from a work camp in Italy. And so my grandmother was left a widow with 4 daughters to raise. And eventually, she brought all 4 of her daughters over to the US. And in Italy, in the town that they were in, she was actually a pretty powerful business person. She had a store. It was the most successful store in the community. She only had a 5th grade education, but that was enough in a little town in Italy at that point. So she was a successful businesswoman, and years later, when she came to the US with 4 daughters to support, she didn't speak English. So what she did was she worked as a seamstress. She worked 2 jobs as a seamstress so that she could take care of her daughters, because she knew that she had to do what needed to be done. And this is what needed to be done to raise her daughters. So a few years later, my mom meets my dad. They get married. And my dad has an opportunity that's going to take them away from New York, which is where they lived at the time. And so, of course, being an Italian daughter, she had to take her mother with her. So when my father fell in love with my mother, he agreed to basically take on her mother as well. So they moved around the US quite a bit. My dad was in the military. They moved around quite a bit, and my nonna came with them every single time. And eventually we ended up in Peoria, Illinois, as all good Italian families do. It's where we all go. So I remember my childhood. My grandmother is a very big part of my childhood memories because she took care of us. My mother was able to work because she had her mother there who could take care of her children when we were young. I remembered her braiding my hair because my mom didn't know how to braid hair. And she would sew for us because she had been a seamstress. She would sew a lot of clothing for us. And so she really took good care of us. And in fact, this doily is here to remind me of my grandmother because she made a lot of these. She crocheted. And she, in fact, made me an entire bedspread out of these crocheted doilies that was supposed to be my wedding gift when I got married. And it has been sitting in a trunk for 43 years. So, much to my mother's chagrin, this bedspread has not gotten much use yet. Someday. And my grandmother was fierce and very practical, very independent woman. She was a lovely woman, but sometimes you get a loose tooth when you're a little child, and if you remember, sometimes you don't want that loose tooth to come out. You sort of wait until it's dangling by a thread, and my brother and I used to do that all the time. My grandmother hated that. So she would sneak up on us when we weren't expecting it, and she would yank the tooth out of our mouth. So we have some funny stories about my nonna. So she was this very independent, powerful woman who was also really funny. And then, of course, as time went on, she wasn't fierce and independent anymore. She lost her hearing pretty early in her 70s. And then later on, she had retinitis pigmentosa, which meant she went completely blind. And she didn't speak English, of course. She only spoke Italian. So at that point, she's almost deaf, pretty much blind, doesn't speak English, and she's completely dependent on my mother to take care of her. And she lived with us this whole time. And it was a very powerful memory. Like when I think back to my childhood, I think back to about a 10-year period where my mother and my father took such good care of my nonna. So it's powerful because my mother never even questioned it. It was what she knew had to be done. It was her responsibility. It was not a choice. And my father gave up a lot because this wasn't his mother. This was his wife's mother, and he had a career, and he had opportunities to go overseas. We had an opportunity to move to Hong Kong, to Australia, but there was no way we could take my nonna all the way across the world after all the moving around they'd already done with her. So he passed up those opportunities. And my mother had the patience of a saint, the way that she took care of my nonna. So my grandmother finally passed away at the age of 94. She lived with us up until the very last few months. My mother would not even think about moving her into a home. And I was the only person I knew of that had a grandmother that lived with them for that long. It wasn't something I knew other families had done, but my mother had done this incredible thing. So around the time that my grandmother passed away, I was also experiencing another big transition. I had been practicing law. I had been practicing law for about 5 years. I thought I was going to save the world by becoming an attorney. This is how I thought I was going to fight for justice. And so I went to law school, and it ended up being one of the worst experiences of my life. It was soul-sucking for me. And it was interesting to see how I reacted to that experience because I made a lot of money. I had a lot of prestige as a lawyer. But what ended up happening was I was just spending a lot of money on things I didn't really need or appreciate, drinking too much because I wasn't particularly happy. And eventually it got to a point where I realized I really need to make a change. So I decided to leave the practice of law, which was a pivotal moment for me. It gave me the opportunity to finally start traveling. And it's something I always wanted to do. I'd really never seen the rest of the world. So I went to Vietnam with some friends of mine on vacation. And we were there, and we had a guide with us who was from Vietnam also. And it was the first time I was experiencing real poverty, like crushing poverty. I'd just never seen it like this before. And she had told us, you know, there's these hawkers, there's a lot of beggars, you don't give. You don't give to the beggars, you ignore them. So we became accustomed to just sort of tuning all of that out. And we were walking around this lake in Hanoi, Vietnam, and this little old woman came up to us and was begging. And all 4 of us ended up walking away. And it was this moment of just complete cognitive dissonance is the only thing I can think of to express what was happening there. It stuck with me until I got home a week later. And I thought, how did this woman end up on the street begging? She must have been 80 years old. Who was taking care of her? Why was no one taking care of her? And why did I walk away? I walked away. And so it just did not sit well. I couldn't sleep. I was just very disturbed. And within about a week of getting home, I found out about this organization that was doing work in Vietnam. They were working on education for children. And I thought, well, that's perfect. I'll get involved with this organization. Because if you educate people, then they can come out of poverty and they won't end up like this little old woman. So I threw myself into this work. And the focus was very much on education for girls, which also made a lot of sense to me because I knew that girls often don't have the opportunity to get an education in developing countries. They're seen as a liability because when they get married, they're going to go live with their husbands' families and take care of their husbands' families. So they're not an asset to their families. And it's actually better if you can marry them off sooner because that's one less mouth to feed. So it was this, I was learning a lot in the process of doing this work, and I went back to Asia several times. And I felt like this was the right path, investing in education for children. And I still believe that, but I started to understand that it's not the only solution and it's not the whole solution because the parents were being left completely out of the equation. If you send a child to school but their parents are still in poverty and still struggling to make ends meet, there's a very high likelihood that they're going to especially pull their daughters out of school at some point because they need them at home to help them work the fields, to help them provide for the family. And the daughters are always going to be the ones to lose out. And it struck me that most people who I was talking to had sort of given up on the mothers. They were like, well, they're illiterate. They don't understand the importance of education for their daughters. And they're really struggling, and they're not able to earn their, make a living to provide for their families, so they just make bad decisions for their children. And that really frustrated me. I started to get really angry because I thought, well, why are you completely giving up on them? Isn't it possible that we can actually create change here? And it just sort of kept rising up on me, like, why is the world giving up on its mothers? That's not okay. My mom didn't give up on her mom. So fast forward a few more years, and you get me to where I am today, which is with an amazing organization that I am really honored to lead. And I met a third woman, Chuna Devi is her name, and I actually just met her last year. I met her in a rural village in Nepal. Almost everyone in the village is a farmer because that's really most of what there is to do there. She was 47 years old when I had this conversation with her, and she talked about how she always thought that being born a girl was worthless. She felt total despair because her family did not send her to school because she was a daughter. She grew up herding cows and goats that her family had. She got married when she was 16. Her husband couldn't find opportunities there, so he moved to India to find employment, and he would send letters home to her, but because she'd never gone to school, she was illiterate, and she couldn't read the letters. So she had to wait for someone to, read them to her. And her mom was living with her, and her mom got sick and cancer. She had to take her to the hospital. So they go to the hospital in the city, and they tell her, you need to go to room 105 to see the doctor who's going to treat your mom. She couldn't find it because she couldn't read. And she was humiliated, got confused, and just left. So here's Chuna Devi, who can't take care of her mother because she can't read. So she did what she had to do, and she came to a center called a Read Center, which is the work that we do. It's a community library. And she signed up for literacy classes, and she learned how to read, and then she learned how to use a mobile phone at the center. And then she started learning different livelihood skills so she could earn more money and make sure that she had enough money to send her daughters to school. She did this for about 2 years, and then she's beaming as she's telling me the rest of the story, which is now she's creating literacy groups, and she's teaching other women how to read in her community. And if you've spent time in the developing world, you know that when a woman experiences this kind of transformation, she wants everyone to experience it. She wants to share it with everybody. And that's the beautiful thing about Chuna. And I know that there are millions of Chunas in the world just waiting to change and to bring this change to everyone else around them. So people ask me all the time, how did you get to doing what you're doing? And don't you ever get tired? Are you tired? And I think back to what my life used to be like, and yes, it was materially better. I had a lot more money to spend. My life was easier in so many ways. But the work I do now, it's not even a choice anymore. It's just the work that needs to get done.